Hello, welcome to Life Reviewed. This is episode 4 and part 4 of my Planet of the Apes retrospective. Today I'm going to be talking about Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. And Conquest is a really pivotal film in this franchise. It is the blueprint for the future Rise of the Planet of the Apes. It shows how the apes originally took over to eventually rule the Planet of the Apes. It's also the first film in the franchise to have an unrated cut. The original cut was deemed too graphic to put in theaters, so it was cut and some extra stuff was added for the theatrical release. But the unrated cut is finally been made available on the Blu-ray, and I'll compare and contrast both versions towards the end. But Conquest of the Planet of the Apes was released in 1972. It was directed by J. Lee Thompson. It was written by Paul Dean, the writer of the last two. It stars Roddy McDowall, no longer as Cornelius, but now as Caesar, Don Murray as Breck, Natalie Trundy. That's a familiar name. She played Dr. Stephanie Branton in the previous film, and in researching her credit, she also played one of the mutants in the subterranean New York City of Beneath. And it didn't take too long to figure out why she keeps appearing in these films. She was married to Arthur P. Jacobs, who was the producer of the first 5 Planet of the Apes films. Harry Rhodes stars as Malcolm McDowell, and Severn Darden plays Culp. Also, we have the return of the illustrious Ricardo Montalban as Armando. So let's get into the plot. The opening title set the film in North America in 1991. Armando explains that in 1983, 10 years after the end of Escape from the Planet of the Apes, which was set 2 years ahead of its theatrical release, a disease killed the world's cats and dogs, leaving humans with no pets. To replace them, humans began keeping apes as household pets. Realizing the apes' capacity to learn and adapt, humans trained them to perform household tasks by 1991. American culture is based on ape slave labor, just as Cornelius described would happen in the previous film. It also suggests that the North America of the 1990s is at least partly a police state, as apes and humans are being watched at all times. Armando and Caesar, a young chimpanzee horseback rider in Armando's circus, distribute flyers around a large city to advertise the circus arrival. Armando warns the chimpanzee to be careful should anyone learn his identity as the son of Cornelius and Zira. It would mean their deaths. They see apes performing various menial tasks and are shocked at the harsh discipline on disobedient apes. Seeing an ape being beaten and drugged, Caesar shouts, "Lousy human bastards!" Quickly, Armando takes responsibility for the exclamation, explaining to the policeman that it was he who shouted, not his chimpanzee. The surrounding crowd becomes agitated and Caesar flees. Hiding in a stairway, Armando tells Caesar he will go to the authorities and bluff his way out of the situation. Meantime, Caesar has to hide among his own kind in a cage of orangutans, and soon finds himself being trained for slavery through violent conditioning. He's then sold at auction to Governor Breck, and Breck allows the ape to name himself by randomly pointing to a word in a book. Handed to him, and the chimpanzee's finger rests upon the name Caesar, feigning coincidence. Caesar is then put to work by Breck's chief aide, MacDonald, who sympathizes with the apes to the thinly veiled disgust of his boss. Meanwhile, Armando is being interrogated by Inspector Culp, who suspects his circus ape is the child of the 2 talking apes from the future. Culp's assistant puts Armando under a machine, the Authenticator, that psychologically forces people to be truthful. After admitting he had heard the name Cornelius before, Armando realizes he cannot fight the machine. A guard comes in to force him to continue the interrogation, but Armando struggles and jumps through a window, falling to his death. Learning of the death of his foster father, the only human that cared for him, Caesar loses faith in human kindness and begins plotting a rebellion. Secretly, Caesar teaches combat to the other apes and has them gather weapons. While doing an errand with Caesar, MacDonald expresses concern for the rising problems and wished he could communicate with Caesar. Caesar exposes himself as the lost circus ape and tells MacDonald of his plans to depose Breck. MacDonald, while understanding of Caesar's intent, has his doubts about the effectiveness of the revolution, as well as Caesar being dismissive of all humans. Meanwhile, Breck learns from Culp that the vessel which supposedly delivered Caesar is from a region with no native chimpanzees. Suspecting Caesar is the ape the police are hunting, Breck's men arrest Caesar and electrically torture him until he speaks. Hearing him speak, Breck orders Caesar's immediate death. Caesar survives his execution because MacDonald secretly lowers the machine's electrical output well below lethal levels. Once Breck leaves, Caesar kills his torturer and escapes. Caesar begins his revolution with the first object to capture ape management. The apes are victorious after killing most of the riot police. After bursting into Breck's command post and killing most of the personnel, Caesar has Breck marched out to be executed. MacDonald pleads with Caesar not to murder Breck and to have compassion for him. And then this is where you have two different endings. So the ending of the theatrical cut and the ending of the unrated cut are very, very different. And they actually, almost make Caesar a different character. So in the original theatrical cut, or I should say actually in the original unrated cut, Caesar gives his final speech, which is, very, he sounds like a tyrant, and then nods to the guerrillas to murder Breck, where they beat him to death, and then it ends with a shot of Caesar's face. And the speech is pretty important because it's, talking about man's downfall and how they'll become slaves to the apes, and the apes will never stand for anything again. In the theatrical cut, they thought that was sort of a downer ending, which is ridiculous because this whole movie is such a downer, and it's so, the original ending is much more in line with the character arc of what Caesar's become. But they decided to add in, for the theatrical cut, this second speech. And so after he gives his whole speech where he says, humans are going to serve apes, and he ends the speech with, "And that day is upon you now." In the theatrical cut, Lisa, his, love interest from the film, says, and it was added in after, she just says, "No, no." She's the first ape other than Caesar to speak. And then Caesar looks at her and just reconsiders and gives a second speech that's like, "But now we'll put away our hatred." Even though he just said, "That day is upon you now." And then he goes, "But now we'll put away our hatred. And if it's God's will, then maybe apes will take over someday." And, tonight we've seen the birth of the Planet of the Apes. And it's all re-recorded audio from Roddy McDowall with the shots from the previous speech of his eyes and of his mouth, and doesn't even match up. It's atrocious. The theatrical ending of this movie is an embarrassment. So it's so much better. The unrated cut is so much better. So I guess we'll talk a little bit more about the other changes. That's the major one, is the ending of this film. It really, sets up the next movie in a very different light, the theatrical and the unrated. Now, we'll get to it when we talk about Battle for the Planet of the Apes, but Battle, I think, is going more off of the theatrical Caesar, where he's compassionate and, he's understanding of humans, and he wants to kind of live with them, doesn't really necessarily want them to be his servants, even though he said it in a speech 2 seconds before. But that's the major difference. But the other differences of the unrated to theatrical cut is just blood. There are a lot of gory scenes in the unrated cut where Breck shoots a gorilla right in the face and blood explodes over everybody, and they're heaping piles of bloody bodies up at the end before the whole scene where they beat Breck to death. And it's like that bright pink blood that they use in some films, where it's just it's so bright and it's so all over the place. So it's kind of cartoony, but it's definitely different than the other Planet of the Apes movies we've watched, where they're not shooting people directly in the face. with blood spatter. So obviously, I prefer the unrated cut. I think it's a really dark film. I think the extra violence and blood just accentuate that, and I like the ending better, where it feels like the character actually, does what he said he's going to do. I understand them trying to rework, Caesar so that he's not such an evil character by the end, for the theatrical cut, but the execution is horrific. I think they should have just cut the original speech and just wrote an entirely new speech, because him delivering this awesome conqueror's speech and then just saying "but never mind" just makes no sense, and it really just feels like a weak cop out for the theatrical cut. So I've spent a lot of time talking about the ending, and that's probably where most of the controversy is. But let's start from the beginning and talk our way through this. So the beginning of the movie, you have Armando and Caesar. Caesar's in a leather jacket. The police are like, "Do you have permission to dress your ape like that?" And Armando says, "Oh yes, this is a famous circus ape." And we know this is, Zira and Cornelius's baby from the previous film, who they wanted to name Milo after Dr. Milo, their friend who had restored Taylor's spaceship. But it seems like Armando's changed Milo's name to Caesar just to kind of hide him some more, which is fine with me. Caesar is a much cooler name. And then Caesar himself goes out of his way to name himself Caesar when he's given the option to look through the book and pick a name. He picks Caesar, so that's what we get, which is great, because obviously you'll see this name come back in the newer trilogy. So so as they're walking around, they're seeing apes are subservient. So they've become, once the cats and dogs died out, humans wanted some pets. They started taking chimpanzees as pets and apes as pets, and they became very smart. And over a course of 10 years or so, they started to really learn from their human masters and sort of evolve rapidly. And they began able to do tasks. So they're in the service industry. They're waiting tables and cleaning up dishes and sweeping, delivering packages. These are the kind of menial tasks that have been passed down to the ape slaves or servants, and they're definitely not treated really well, because they get beaten and they get kind of harassed all the time and yelled at, and they're always being yelled at, "No, no, no," as part of their conditioning. They say, they go through, and when Caesar gets separated from Armando and ends up, going with the apes for conditioning, you see how they train them to do all these things. They give them, challenges, and they teach them how to wash dishes, and they teach them how to do different things. And Caesar's the smartest by far. He's trying to play it down a little bit, but he's just so much smarter than all the other apes, and he's helping all the other apes kind of learn how to do their stuff a lot faster. And these apes are being brought in from Africa. And so Caesar, doesn't like what he sees. He doesn't like that the humans are mistreating the apes. He's totally astonished. He's been in hiding in the circus his whole life. And so he goes about sort of, beginning the fueling this revolution. And when Governor Breck is watching over the new apes, it's like a slave auction. They see how smart Caesar is, and he has McDonald buy him. And then that's when he lets him pick his name, and he starts working, inside, kind of like infiltration from the inside out. And some of the best parts are when he starts to get this revolution going, and the other apes are stealing weapons, from the kitchen. They're stealing knives, and they're stealing guns from their owners, and they're stockpiling in this abandoned warehouse. Caesar's having them stockpile weapons, and there's tons of letter carrying. The apes lots of apes are in charge of like delivering letters and picking up, doing like shopping for people. And there's like multiple scenes where they'll have shopping lists, the ape, and they'll go and hand it to someone. They'll hand, like a shop owner. The shop owner will hand them back whatever it says. They can't read or write, so they hand them back, the product, and they bring them back to their master. And so Caesar has the apes bring him the shopping lists, and then he adds a line onto the shopping list like, oh yeah, I need, like it says, oh, I need, this and this and this, and Caesar adds, and 200 rounds of ammunition. And so then the ape brings the letter to the shop owner gives them all this stuff plus the extra ammunition, and then they drop the ammunition off with Caesar and then bring the rest of the items back to their master, who wouldn't suspect anything. And I think that is so genius. And Caesar's the only ape who can read or write, so it's totally like unexpected, and nobody would suspect this whatsoever. When Armando dies, and that's a whole like really strange scene where they put him in the torture device and he jumps out the window and kills himself. And once Caesar hears this, it really sets him over the edge, and that's when everything really begins. And when the apes finally decide to kind of go crazy, the whole third act of this film is violence. Caesar is running with machine guns, like gunning police officers down. They're like in these huge battles of beating police officers, and everything looks just like a total crazy riot. The uncut version is adding in all these like bloody, gory shots, but still, it's a pretty violent film, especially in comparison to what we've seen in this franchise so far. I think it's awesome. All this stuff is like gold. You want to see Caesar rise up in this film. It's just like, it's really sad to see the apes walking around doing all this like slave labor. And so when they rise up and they all start, like going crazy in the restaurants and on their masters and everything, and then they like form these massive groups and are out there doing these riots and killing people and stuff. It's really awesome. And there's this like, when they burst into ape management and they're like fighting the guy with the flamethrower and they're beating him to death, and then like they go into Breck's office and after he shoots that gorilla in the face, and they go in and like they saw through the door with like a blowtorch, and then Caesar just comes in like total guns blazing, like with a machine gun, just like unloading. Things are exploding. This movie, just like this third act, delivers so much. It's so exciting and intense, and you can see where they watch this film and we're like, okay, we need this in Rise of the Planet of the Apes. We need this level of like intensity at the end. And so this is definitely the blueprint for what Rise of the Planet of the Apes will become. So let's talk a little bit about Roddy McDowall's performance as Caesar. So he really got to show off his acting chops in the previous film Escape as Cornelius, but Cornelius is a very soft-spoken, very scholarly, intellectual chimpanzee. So it's a much different performance than what we get here with Caesar. Caesar's he is intelligent, obviously, and he definitely bears resemblance to Cornelius. But when he starts, when something breaks inside him, he really feels like a different character. He's like he goes completely mad, and that speech at the end, his eyes look totally crazy, and he. You can see why everybody is like all the other apes are following him. So I actually like this performance more than his Cornelius performance. I think he's he really, really bought into the body language, and he'll play a third ape, Galen, in the TV show a few years later, and which is again sort of like a mix of his other performances. But yeah, he loves playing. He's getting apes at this point. He's getting much more fluid, and his Caesar performance is I would say probably his best performance is Caesar in this film, because he has a lot to do, and he carries the entire film. So for my review, I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. I think it's probably the second best film in the first 5 movies, at least my second favorite. It's not as tight as Escape from the Planet of the Apes, especially from a story and screenplay perspective, but there's more interesting things going on screen, and it's a really exciting film. It has the most intense third act of any of these original 5 movies. I think the theatrical cut is confused at the ending of of what it wants to be. I think the unrated cut is a little more definitive, but even then, I'm not sure that they were sure they were going to fully commit to that ending. So it's not perfect, but it's a hell of a time, and it's a really exciting film. So next up will be Battle for the Planet of the Apes, the 5th and final film in the original Planet of the Apes saga. And that one's coming up next. So thank you for joining me on Life Reviewed. Please, as always, like, comment, and subscribe. Give any feedback that you have. And I will see you next time for Battle.